I will watch pretty much any story and find something to enjoy about it. I love every Doctor and every era. But you can't win every time. You can't get it right every time. There are stories in each Doctor's era which aren't great. And I've compiled this list because I compile lists. And this is the worst, or at least the least great story per Doctor. Now, I've seen or I've seen almost all of Doctor Who. I have not listened to all of Big Finish, so for certain Doctors, this list might change. Though I'm not really gonna put the worst story for Tom Baker as a Big Finish story because he's got 7 years of TV material. But for say six, though I've never heard a sixth Doctor story that was worse on Big Finish. I would, if he had a really bad one, I might count that, or eight. Eight would be a good example. If the eighth Doctor, I listened to one of his later Big Finish stories, and it's just terrible, that's probably gonna go to be the worst story on the list. But that said, most of the stories that are on this list are TV stories, because that's the core of Doctor Who as a fandom and as a franchise. Though Big Finish is canon, and if you disagree, you can fight me. Now, for the first Doctor, William Hartnell, his worst story, a lot of people would put The Web Planet, but I really like The Web Planet. It's cheesy, it doesn't look great, but those are factors I like about it. It's comfort food TV. But his worst story is a pure historical. It's called The Gunfighters. And if you have not seen The Gunfighters, it is not on this list for being boring. It is a very weird experience. It's Doctor Who, but full of singing, like just way too much singing, and a bunch of the worst American accents I have ever heard in Doctor Who, which is saying something. It just you can't overstate how weird and bonkers and crazy The Gunfighters is. It's about Doc Holliday, the shootout at the OK Corral. The Doctor gets involved. People think he's Doc Holliday. He gets his tooth pulled out. There's so much singing. I can't overstate that either, but it's a weird serial. And I say it's the worst, but I don't regret having seen it. I don't regret having seen any Doctor Who. But if you're going to see this, don't expect to be impressed. Maybe just look at it like the Rocky Horror Picture Show, or The Room is, or more like The Room than Rocky Horror, is something that is so bad, like bad, it is good. But for the second Doctor, I have a lot less strong feelings on the story I put for him, because I pretty much like all of Patrick Troughton's stories. This one is just kind of meh. It's the Dominators. It's another formulaic Doctor Who story. Evil is bad, good is good, I like to be free, and it's really not that interesting. It's Patrick Troughton gives a great performance as always. It's shot pretty well, but it just, in comparison to everything else that I have seen of his, I have not listened to or looked at a lot of missing stories, so maybe something there is worse, but out of everything I've seen of Patrick Troughton, that is his worst outing as the Doctor. Now, for the third Doctor, it's the Time Monster. The Time Monster isn't terrible, but with this, it is just too formulaic. It's a story where the Master is trying to harness some ancient evil power, and the Doctor's trying to stop him, and that's just about it. There's cool time concepts that they don't explore, like they could have gotten real timey-wimey and interesting, but it doesn't. It just feels like you got to use the Master, and let's have him do the same thing he did last week, but This time, let's not add anything new or original of our own, so well, people watch it. People like Roger Delgado. People like Jon Pertwee. But, I've watched it, and I like it, but it's just... There's nothing of its own that stands out. Roger Delgado is fantastic. He and Jon Pertwee have a great chemistry on screen, but that's about it. And if you're just looking for a Roger Delgado, Jon Pertwee, Doctor Who story, then there's a lot of other options. Now, for the Fourth Doctor, his worst story is pretty much pure propaganda. It's Nightmare of Eden. It is Doctor Who does 1980s or late 70s drug paranoia. It's entirely about why you shouldn't do drugs and drugs are bad and drug people are evil. Don't be a drug person. So boring and preachy, and it does have some cool concepts. It's kind of similar to Carnival of Monsters in part of its premise, but it just mostly chooses to focus on people doing drugs and that being a bad thing, and you don't do drugs, kids. So I can't recommend it on the cool premises that exist within it, though they do improve it a little bit. Now, for the Sixth Doctor, my choice here is probably not a huge surprise to people who are knowledgeable about the classic era. This story is often considered the worst story in all of Doctor Who, and I would disagree there. I think there are worse stories on this list alone, but it is the Twin Dilemma. Now, the Twin Dilemma, a lot of people will complain, but there are a few big problems in it. A lot of it works okay. The villains work not super noteworthy. Besides one of the Doctor's mentors from Gallifrey is there, and he is kind of cool. That's kind of the stand-up element of the story. This is the Sixth Doctor's first story, by the way, so I mentioned this in my previous video. That's kind of where it goes awry. It makes him look just like a jerk, a big jerk face who hates the Fifth Doctor, strangles his companion, constantly says the rudest, most inconsiderate thing. It takes the concepts they wanted to go with for him way too far, and it was hard to step back after that point. But it could be worse. It has a really kind of touching ending. The twins of the title, the Twin Dilemma, the twin children, Romulus and Remus, I mean, their names are kind of cool. I mean, I do realize what that is a reference to, the founders of Rome and Legend, but I mean, that's kind of a cool nod. Their performances aren't great, but the Doctor's mentor is pretty much the only really noteworthy strong part. But aside from the very beginning and the kind of direction they were going with the character, there's not a lot to complain about with this story. It's okay to really bad in certain moments. But I tend to like a lot of Sixth Doctor stories, so this makes the bottom of my list for him. But there's even Time Lash, which a lot of people hate Time Lash. I like it. It's a little formulaic. It's not super original in anything with its premise, but it's not bad. This has some real bad stuff in it. Now, for the Eighth Doctor, I was considering putting on audio here, but I'm not all the way through his audios. He's still with Charlie, where I'm listening, and the worst things I've heard have been just meh. Whereas on screen, he has the TV movie, which I have suggested to watch. it is still the worst thing I've seen or listened to with his Doctor in it so far. It The Master isn't great in it. He's basically the Terminator. It is not shot great through a lot of it. Like, I don't hate some of it. Like, some of it is shot kind of cool. It feels like a weird, like, 90s American Fox Doctor Who, which is what it was, but a lot of it is very meh. The They do an amnesia plot, which I don't super think was needed, and kind of makes it harder to establish like the character when you've only got one episode. And they do kill off the Seventh Doctor in the beginning with a hail of gunfire and then a botched heart surgery. And while I don't hate that premise for regeneration, I don't hate the idea of a doctor being just randomly shot. They didn't give Seven a lot of chance to shine there, which I would have liked, and also it just is distracting. We didn't The audience that they were introducing the show to, the Americans, for the most part, not familiar with the Seventh Doctor, so that was confusing to them. Presumably, that's what I would perceive from watching it and putting my mind in their shoes, but that doesn't work super well. A lot of the characterization feels rushed. A lot of the plot points feel rushed and forced. And one thing that a lot of people do complain about is the Doctor and the Master both stating that the Doctor is half human. This doesn't super upset me. I don't think it's necessarily a terrible idea, but I don't think they need to do it. I think if they were going to introduce that concept, they should have waited after the series had been picked up and kind of hints and nods and see where that goes. Though I do think the fact it added that sort of unclear part of the canon to the canon is interesting, and I like that that's something you can choose to believe, and they even nodded at that in the Series 9 finale, which I will talk about later on this list. So it's not terrible, but it is definitely the worst thing I have seen or heard with the Eighth Doctor so far. Now, for the Ninth Doctor, a lot of people would put Boomtown, but I think Boomtown is a nice little character piece. I mean, in comparison to the worst story, which is Aliens of London, World War III. This is farting gas bag monsters that are an obvious parody of British politicians, not very clever. Just not many good elements in this story. I do like that they reference UNIT and how the Doctor was a member of UNIT. I do like that the Doctor brings Rose Tyler back a year after he took her, and a lot of her problems in her personal life have been directly caused by him. I do like what they do with Mickey and with Jackie. And the casting is good for the farting gas bag monsters. And the performances are good all around, but the premise, the constant fart jokes, those aren't good. Oh, and I also like the pig, the pig, and how Christopher Eccleston's Doctor reacts to it being killed, which is a really great Doctorish moment. But overall, it's just not a good story. Boomtown, yes, it has a farting gas bag monster, but there's a lot less farting. There's a lot more character moments. It feels more like a Silence of the Lambs type thing, which is way better. And I really don't understand at all how people rate Boomtown lower. I also don't understand how people rate The Long Game lower. The Long Game is just a great story. It doesn't make my number one or anything, but it's just really good Doctor Who, and the closest it gets to like an Outer Spacey vibe for most of Series 1. Now, with the 10th Doctor, David Tennant, his worst story is in his first series, Fear Her, which is just not very interesting at all. A lot of the performances for The guest actors aren't great. I'm not opposed to the companion taking the lead, but David Tennant is the best part of David Tennant's era, so it doesn't have a lot of him in it, and it also isn't like a Doctor and Companion line episode. I mean, I do like Rose Tyler, but it just didn't work for me in a lot of ways. And it does set up the themes they're going for the end of the series. So those last few moments are pretty good. And I do like the concept of the threat, but none of it is executed very well, and it just comes off looking and sounding very cheap. Now, the worst story for also I would like to mention that people will often choose his worst, or say that his worst story, the 10th Doctor's worst story, is from his series 2, his first series, but it is Love and Monsters. They are wrong. Love and Monsters is funny, and it is weird, and yeah, it doesn't work in everything it goes for. There are some things that I wouldn't have chosen to do, but it ultimately works for me, and I find it more interesting and a more enjoyable watch than Fear Her. Not my favorite episode, but more to enjoy, in my opinion. But the worst story for the 11th Doctor, that 11's my Doctor. I love him. He pretty much, Matt Smith gives a great performance with any script. But this story that I would go with, a lot of people will say Victory of the Daleks, but Victory of the Daleks, I really liked Winston Churchill, and I really liked what it did at the very end to sort of set up the rise of a Dalek empire that wasn't going to be destroyed every episode it featured in. I don't mind the Dalek design that they introduced, and I thought it worked well as a standalone. I'm not a big fan of Mark Gatiss's episodes, but that's pretty standard Mark Gatiss overall. So he has done better, but I mean, I think a lot of the hate it gets is the fact that it was following up on a pretty subpar run for the Daleks. They had last appeared in the Series 4 finale, which they did work well in, but previously to that, the last time they had appeared as a regular episode was in Daleks in Manhattan, Evolution of the Daleks, which was just garbage, and it started to feel like the Daleks were being misused all the time, and that they were not heading in a good direction. And because this wasn't a standout episode, people piled hate onto it, which I don't think they needed to do. We can be honest and just say, this could have been much better. Now, but yes, getting back to my point, his worst episode is Hyde. Now, this was an episode I looked forward to a lot. It's not because I loved the writer or because there was a director on it or even a returning monster. It was because I saw the trailer and I got super pumped for Series 7, Part 2. And in it, there's a really cool atmospheric scene where the Doctor is in a forest. He looks really scared. He's been running, and he says, "I am the Doctor, and I am afraid." It felt like this was going to be some big, epic moment that was truly chilling and amazing. It wasn't. It was part of Hyde. It was maybe one of the better parts of that episode, but Hyde wasn't very good. I liked the cast. I felt the atmosphere was good throughout. There was a really good sequence where they look at the entire history of Earth and take pictures of each part of it to help figure out the threats in the episode. That part alone would have been made a great short film for Doctor Who, or a minisode. But overall, it was pretty meh. largely confined to the interior of a house, but nothing like crazy happens inside there for the most part. At the very end, you find out that it's all because of love and there was no real threat, and that it just they spring that twist at the end on you, and it really sucks because I wanted there to be a real threat. The monster design was great, and it could have been a really iconic monster, but they just it's in love, and okay, let's get it's Bay here so they can be in love together and do love, which happens in several episodes, but of Doctor Who was in the Moffat era. He doesn't write those episodes. I don't know why that's been popping up more, but I wish it wouldn't have been a thing, and it works the least in this episode. Like, there are episodes where this happens, where I like it, or at least don't hate it so much, but it just really doesn't work for this episode. It destroys everything the episode built. Now, but it's not a terrible episode, it just ends up letting itself down in a lot of ways, and it doesn't have enough to offer to make it great. Now, for the 12th Doctor, his worst episode is pretty much universally ridiculed among fans. It is Heaven Sent. Now, Heaven Sent, depending on my mood, is enjoyable to watch. This depends on my mood greatly, because I like stories set on Gallifrey. I like Murray Gold's scores, specifically for finales and big episodes, because I feel like he does know how to capture that kind of emotion, and his scores often improve the scenes a lot. And I like The Shielder. And the character of Rassilon. And I'm not opposed to how they characterize the native Gallifreyans, the non-Time Lords. But that list of things I like about Heaven Sent. Actually, shoot, I said Heaven Sent. I did mean Hellbent. Hellbent is very short. Hellbent is the worst episode because it takes what had been built up since the day of the Doctor, and it kind of just spits all over it. We go back to Gallifrey, and that was really they just accomplished that in one episode. The previous episode, it did take trillions of years, but also the Day of the Doctor was right after Series 7, and this is Series 9. I was wanting like a decade, or at least 5 or 6 years before we saw Gallifrey again. So it felt too soon. And then when it happened, the story wasn't about him being on Gallifrey or like the consequences of that or their place in the universe. It didn't do any of that. It just had the Doctor break all his own rules, and honestly, I don't like that. It didn't ruin the episodes before, but it really brought them down, in my opinion. Oh, specifically Face the Raven. I feel like Hellbent is a great episode. It's about loss and depression and getting over things. But Face the Raven was a perfect ending for Clara. They just cancel that out because she comes back and she gets to live her life. And yeah, sure, she goes back to die there, but she potentially could exist for hundreds of years, have thousands of adventures. And the fact that eventually, yeah, she goes back there, that's not a tragic ending. It's not. and it's not an ending. We don't actually know that she goes back. I mean, sure, she logically should, but she could just keep holding it off till the universe ends, and there will be no consequences for her. Now, Hellbent, once again, it brought down Face the Raven. It also, Heaven Sent, it was about getting over things, and then the Doctor doesn't get over things, he just reverses them, which is a cheap, sorry, I'm itchy, a cheap way to address death and loss, to say, oh, well, the Doctor can fix that. Well, you're not the Doctor. This is made for the audience, and it doesn't have a coherent message, which is just infuriating. And then, not only does the Doctor reverse what happened, or save Clara, he also shoots someone. He shoots a friend of his. He shoots the General, who, yes, they're not best buddies, but the General has been nothing but kind to the Doctor and has constantly tried to do what's right, help them but make a better Gallifrey, and has been a really loyal person. And then just because the General attempts to protect the Web of Time and the universe and keep the Doctor from changing destiny, the Doctor shoots him. And sure, the Doctor asks what regeneration he's on, but regeneration doesn't always work. He could have just straight up murdered someone, but because, yes, he's likely to regenerate, that's okay. It's not okay. You can't just trade lives. And, of course, in this episode, he treats it like it's... He calls it, death is like Time Lord Manflu, I think he says. But in the 10th Doctor seemed to not be super pumped to regenerate. In fact, almost none of the Doctors seem to have a very favorable opinion of that. And he put someone through that because they did their job and tried to protect the universe. The Doctor's supposed to protect the universe. The Doctor's not supposed to put his companions' lives ahead of that. The Doctor is not supposed to go back and change his personal timeline. And if he was, I mean, I've actually seen another YouTuber point this out. Why not save Adric? You know, the child he led to his death? Sure, Adric could be a bit annoying, but Adric was a kid who idolized the Doctor, and a lot of that is why he died. It is... yeah, I don't hate Clara as a character. I think she's not a perfect character. She could have been done... Her writing could have been better, but she didn't deserve to die. Still, the Doctor doesn't have that right to go back and change things. I was recently listening to Dominion, starring the 7th Doctor, his audio play, and he talks about how he never wanted to get to a point where he thought the rules didn't apply to him. And I think at the time it was written in response to the 10th Doctor, Time Lord Victorious, but this still applies. The Doctor should understand the laws of the universe and what he can and can't do. And when he steps out of line, I don't think it's inconsistent with the character, but it's not how I like the character to be portrayed. So, to summarize, this story hurts the impact of the previous 2 episodes, which were fantastic, ruins pretty much all of Series 9, as far as it being a big, coherent story that is good. It shows the Doctor, and particularly the 12th Doctor, in a negative light. It further worsens the character arc of Clara, who I think would be appreciated more had this not happened. It throws away a lot of what was built up since the Day of the Doctor, which is a great story, and wastes Gallifrey. it's just a just a huge disappointment, and it's a shame that this got made the way it did, because there were some great ideas in there. And there were things which were workable. And D'Schilder, I liked her as a concept, and I thought bringing her back for the series finale wasn't a bad idea. But not like this. Now, there are a few things I would like to praise. I say a few things. Right now I can only think of, well, I did like that they referenced the Doctor potentially being half human, but didn't make a statement about that, because I do like the fact that that's part of the TV movie, as previously mentioned. But they bring that up in connection to the hybrid plotline, which was a huge mess and didn't need to exist. And also, I enjoyed the parts where the Doctor was playing guitar. I didn't like how those connected to the overall plot of the episode. And I did like how they talked about the Doctor and how he was seen as a war hero now. That was kind of interesting. But really, there's not a lot of great parts in this episode, and it's a real letdown for an honestly pretty good series, which could have been looked at as a great series had this been better. And once again, I don't absolutely hate any of these stories. There's none of these that I won't rewatch, but Doctor Who can be fantastic. It can be some of the best stuff out there. But it can also be not so great. And I hope Series 11 is full of a lot of great stories and not a lot of stuff like this. Anyway, thank you for sticking through this and watching and listening to what I have to say. You know what to do. Like, subscribe, comment, tell me what you think. Do you agree? Do you disagree?